If you had asked me when I was young what the first stage of compounding feels like, I would not have said wealth. I would have said insult, because that is what most people feel in the beginning. They save, they invest, they deny themselves things they could easily buy, they delay gratification, they try to act like adults with money, then they look at the number on the screen and it barely moves. That is the moment when the whole idea starts to feel dishonest. It feels like pouring water into sand. It feels like discipline without reward. It feels like the world promised a machine and then handed you a spoon. That is why so many people quit. Not because compounding is weak, because the early phase feels offensive to the nervous system of a person raised on visible rewards. I have always thought that one of the biggest failures in financial education is that people are told compounding is powerful, but almost never told what the first stretch of it actually feels like. It does not feel magical. It feels slow enough to make a decent person doubt his own intelligence. And if you do not understand that in advance, you may walk away from one of the finest wealth-building engines ever available to ordinary people precisely because you mistook the design for a defect. I once knew a young man named Harry who taught me that lesson in a way I never forgot. Harry was not a hedge fund manager. He was not a finance enthusiast. He was not the sort of fellow who sat around discussing discounted cash flows because he enjoyed hearing himself say the phrase discounted cash flows. He worked the front desk at a hotel, rotating shifts, inconsistent sleep. A take-home income that felt respectable enough to survive and too thin to impress anyone. He shared a cramped two-bedroom with a roommate because the rent alone would have humiliated him in a one-bedroom. He drank too much vending machine coffee because exhaustion is a stronger force than taste. He kept telling himself he would get serious about money when life calmed down. Life did not calm down. That is another lesson worth learning early. Life almost never calms down first. The people who build wealth do not wait for life to stop interrupting them. They build inside the interruption. Harry eventually did what millions of people do. He promised himself he was finally going to begin investing. He downloaded the app. He watched the clips. He heard the slogans. Start now. Be disciplined. Stay consistent. Buy your future. All of that sounded noble enough in the abstract. Then the market dipped. His little account balance went down, and the sentence that rises in the mind of almost every beginner rose in his. What is the point? That sentence has delayed more freedom than most bear markets, because in that moment the person does not feel lazy, he feels rational. He says, I am doing the right thing and nothing is happening. That is where people leave, not because compounding failed, because the scoreboard is lying to them. I want you to understand what I mean by that. In the early years, the ordinary investor thinks the score should be dollars. He looks at the account and wants visible growth. He wants to feel momentum. He wants proof that his effort has changed his life in a way that can be emotionally respected. But the first stage of compounding is not about growth. It is about mass. You are not yet watching the snowball roll downhill. You are still packing the first layer of snow into something that can survive the hill. That is why the beginning looks dead. The machine is not broken. The machine is being assembled. Most people never receive that explanation clearly enough, so they judge the whole process while standing inside the least flattering stage of it. That is a terrible place from which to make a permanent decision. Harry almost made that decision. He had been consistent for 287 days, not perfect consistent. There is a huge difference. He was putting in money when he could, sometimes $37, sometimes $51, sometimes $29. Sometimes a little more when the hotel had been busy and he got some extra shifts. He was not the hero of a motivational poster. He was just trying. And the balance still felt insulting. Then he almost did what the public always does. He almost quit right before the logic was about to become visible. This is why I believe people need not only a strategy for money, but a strategy for patience. Patience is too expensive to leave undefined. If you merely tell yourself to be patient, you are relying on mood. And mood is a weak bridge between ordinary stress and long-term reward. A person needs a structure for patience the same way he needs a structure for saving. That is where Harry stumbled into something useful. He created a rule, not a fantasy. Not a mantra, a rule. He called it the 843 rule. Now, numbers make people stupid. If they think the numbers themselves are magic, they are not. This was not numerology. It was a way of giving his mind a timing lens so he would stop demanding that the journey feel the same from the beginning to the end. The 8-4-3 rule says something very simple. The first 8 years are about building the engine. The next 4 are about watching the engine start pulling. The next 3 are where the machine finally begins to feel heavier than your own labor. Those numbers are not a promise written by God into the market. They are a way of organizing the psychology. And psychology matters because most people are not destroyed by bad mathematics. They are destroyed by the emotional meaning they attach to perfectly normal mathematics. Let me explain how Harry changed that meaning. The first thing he had to understand was what he was even buying. This sounds too basic for some people, and that is why so many remain confused. If a person does not understand what an index fund actually is, then he is going to judge it with the wrong expectations. An index fund is not one stock, it is a basket. I sometimes tell people it is more like a playlist than a single song. If you buy one stock, you are betting that one song stays beautiful and popular and commercially relevant for a long time. If you buy the playlist, you are buying a rotating collection of the songs that together represent the larger taste of the market that matters. The ordinary person does not need to identify the single perfect company. He needs to own productive business in a sane, low-cost way and stay in the room long enough for the machine to do its work. That is the central promise of broad index investing, not brilliance, participation, and participation over long enough stretches has been richly rewarded precisely because human productivity keeps expressing itself through business, even while individual firms come and go. Harry did not need to become an analyst. He needed to stop expecting the playlist to feel like a solo performance in year 1. That was the first mental shift. The second shift was even more important. He stopped tracking dollars. He started tracking shares. That sounds tiny. It is not. Dollars are emotional, shares are structural. If the market falls and you are only staring at dollars, you feel poorer. If the market falls and you are staring at shares, you are more likely to recognize that the same contribution now buys more of the productive machine. That is not a motivational trick. That is a more accurate scoreboard in the early years. Harry wrote his share count on an index card and taped it inside his closet door. He did not need a beautiful dashboard. He needed one number that told the truth. Every week he updated it. One number, not the account balance, not the gain, the share count. That is when the whole process stopped looking like failure. Because in the beginning, the real win is accumulation, not visible growth. Accumulation, this is where the public makes its costliest error. It asks the beginning of the journey to produce the feeling that belongs to the middle. Then it quits when the wrong feeling fails to appear. Let me give you some arithmetic. Suppose a person invests around $230 or $240 a month on average. Not a huge number, not enough for social media to clap. Not enough for a neighbor to notice, just enough to matter if repeated for a long time. At the end of 1 year, he has perhaps put away $2,800 or a little more. That is respectable. It is not exciting. At the end of 3 years, the total may still not look like a transformed life. That is where the trap springs. Because the brain says, if 3 years did not change my life, 15 years probably will not either. That is the lie. The lie is not that compounding fails. The lie is that the first stage predicts the later stage. It does not. The first stage and the later stage are not the same experience at all. I have often said that investing is one of the only places where success requires enduring long stretches that do not feel like success. That is why so few people get the full result. They are willing to try. They are not willing to stay. Harry eventually understood that the first 8 years were not supposed to feel rich. They were supposed to make him hard to break. That is a profound difference. Most people think the purpose of investing is to become wealthy. Fine, that is one purpose. But before investing makes you wealthy, it is supposed to make you stable enough to remain an investor. That is what the engine-building years do. They rewire your identity if you let them. Harry did something else that amused me and impressed me in equal measure. He attached the habit to something physical from his own life. Every time he clocked out of the hotel at the end of a shift, he held his key card for 10 seconds and asked himself one question: did I buy my future today? That is a much better question than how do I feel about the market If the answer was no, he did not stage a moral trial. He did not say, I am a failure. He did not create shame. He simply made a small purchase, $37, $51.29. Whatever the day allowed, the amount was intentionally small enough to be hard to reject. That is why it worked. The average person designs systems around the person he wishes he were. Harry designed a system around the person he actually was. Tired, human, imperfect, busy, sometimes discouraged. So he made the action tiny, repeatable, and attached to a cue he could not avoid. That is better than inspiration. Inspiration is expensive and unreliable. Mechanism is cheap and durable. There is a sentence from James Clear that I have always thought captured something important. You do not rise to your goals, you fall to your systems. That is exactly right. A person may have beautiful intentions. If the system is weak, the intention eventually loses. Harry did not become successful because he felt more inspired than others. He became successful because he made quitting harder than continuing. He also made selling expensive. This part may sound silly, but I admire silly things when they work honestly. He told his roommate that if he ever sold everything during a market panic, he would immediately owe him $43 cash, a ridiculous little penalty, which is exactly why it worked, because it turned an emotional decision into a friction-carrying decision. The mind now had to say, not only am I uncomfortable, but am I uncomfortable enough to pay actual cash to behave emotionally? Usually the answer was no. Tiny frictions often stop enormous mistakes. I have seen that over and over again. The public imagines discipline must come from grand speeches and pure will. Often it comes from a stupid little mechanism that makes the wrong behavior slightly more annoying. That is enough. Now, let us return to the 843 rule because it matters not just psychologically but structurally. The first 8 years are about engine building. That means your contributions are doing almost all the heavy lifting. The account is still too small for the returns themselves to transform the picture. Visibly, you are the worker, the money is the apprentice, the machine is learning how to matter. This is where most people get offended. They say, I am doing all the work and the money is barely helping. That is correct. That is also temporary. If you stay in the next phase, the following 4 years, something starts to happen that changes the emotional texture of the process. Your contributions still matter greatly, but returns begin showing up in chunks, large enough to notice. You look at the account and begin having the strange feeling that perhaps the money itself is finally joining the conversation. That is a dangerous phase in one sense. It is the phase where people start thinking they got good at investing. Number, they did not suddenly get wise. They simply stayed long enough for the original architecture to reveal itself. The public always wants to attribute visible results to improved intelligence rather than elapsed time. This is especially true in bull markets. A person sticks with a broad market fund for years, the market runs, and suddenly he speaks as though he developed a unique gift. That is nonsense. He got a different phase of the machine. That phase must be handled calmly or it turns people foolish. Harry remained boring here. That is what I liked most about him. He did not become dramatic. When the account began behaving better, he kept using the key card trigger, he kept tracking shares, he kept buying the playlist. He did not suddenly need prediction or sophistication because the machine no longer insulted him. That is wise behavior. Then come the final 3 years of the lens again, not a guaranteed schedule. A lens, this is where compounding starts to feel strange in the best possible way. The contributions still matter, but the returns start looking like another worker entirely. The money begins producing numbers large enough that the person has a hard time recognizing himself as the sole source of progress. The snowball has mass now. The car you were pushing starts rolling. The thing that once required all your force begins carrying some of its own momentum. This is the stage almost everybody wants. Very few earn it because it is purchased by surviving the stage almost nobody respects. That is the tragedy of investing in one sentence. People want the reward while despising the season that makes it possible. I want to be very concrete here because people need numbers, not merely philosophy. Harry stayed with this habit for a little over 7 years. He was still not rich. That is not the point. His total contributions had reached a little over $21,000. The account was around $32,000 or $33,000. The market had done meaningful work for him now, roughly $11,000 or $12,000 of gain, depending on when you looked. Nothing about that result would impress a hedge fund manager. It changed Harry's psychology completely, because this was the first time in his life that capital had done visible work on his behalf, not fantasy work, not projection, real work. That is when the nervous system changes. A person who sees his money doing something real begins relating to the future differently. He no longer imagines wealth only as a giant event. He begins trusting process. That trust is worth more than people know. I have always believed that becoming wealthy is not only about the account. It is about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs constant emotional proof to continue doing what is rational. That is what Harry was becoming. And the proof that he had truly changed did not come from the portfolio itself. It came from the moment life tried to force him to reverse the process. His car needed a real repair. Not something cute, not a little inconvenience. A real repair. The mechanic quoted him an amount large enough to make the ordinary person glance immediately toward the investment account and say, I will just pause, I will just sell a little, I will just borrow from my future for a present problem. That is how wealth dies. Not in theory there. Harry did something else. He picked up extra shifts. He rearranged the discomfort instead of liquidating the seed that may have done more for his future than any single market return in the same year, because it proved to him that he was no longer building an account, he was building a person, the kind of person who does not sell tomorrow to make today slightly easier unless tomorrow is truly expendable. That identity matters. The public likes to think wealth is a spreadsheet event. It is an identity event. First, the spreadsheet reflects the identity. When a person becomes the kind of person who protects the share count, who keeps the habit, who treats downturns as more pieces of the playlist, instead of as personal insult, he is becoming very difficult to stop. That is the real beginning of wealth, not the large number, the durability of the behavior. Now I want to say something that almost nobody says clearly enough. The 843 rule is not about literal doubling schedules. It is not saying your money doubles exactly on command in neat phases. Markets are not that polite. Returns cluster oddly. Sequences vary. Starting valuations matter. Interest rates matter. Inflation matters. The world is under no obligation to produce a symmetrical chart that flatters your planning instinct. The rule is about experience. It is about recognizing that compounding does not feel the same all the way through. The earliest stage feels slow enough to create disbelief. The middle stage feels like relief. The later stage feels almost unfair compared with the effort that began it. That is the timing lens. And because it is only a lens, I care more that people grasp the structure than that they memorize the numbers. If you remember nothing else, remember this. At first your labor carries the capital. Then the capital starts helping. Then, if you remain calm enough, the capital begins carrying more of the story than your fresh labor does. That is the handoff. And the handoff is where the financial life starts feeling different. This is why missing the early years is so costly. The person who says, I will start later because right now the numbers are too small, is walking away from the stage where identity and mass are both built. He is not merely delaying the start of returns. He is delaying the transformation of himself into someone who can actually survive the later phases. That matters enormously. The same is true for the person who starts and quits. He usually tells himself he is being rational because the account felt too small, too volatile, too unimpressive. What he is actually doing is abandoning the machine just before it learns how to help him. That is a very expensive misunderstanding. I sometimes think of compounding as a delayed explosion, not because it is violent, because people expect the force to appear in the wrong place. They expect the first tiny inputs to produce immediate spectacle. They do not. The pressure builds invisibly. Then later, the force becomes obvious enough that outsiders think something sudden occurred. Nothing sudden occurred. Time finally became visible. This is what I wish more people understood. If you are in year 1, year 2, year 4, year 6, and the whole thing still feels modest, awkward, and a little insulting, that does not mean you are behind. It means you are inside the least flattering stage of a very normal design. That is all. The mistake is not the slow beginning. The mistake is believing the slow beginning tells you what the later story will feel like. It does not. And because it does not, the only thing you truly need in the beginning is a way to stay. Not a perfect spreadsheet, not a beautiful app, not a heroic salary, a way to stay. A trigger, a mechanism, a scoreboard that tells the truth, a rule that protects patience. Maybe it is a key card, maybe it is brushing your teeth, maybe it is lunch break, maybe it is closing the laptop at night. I do not care what the cue is, I care that the cue exists. The best system is not the most sophisticated one. It is the one that survives your actual life. That is what Harry discovered. And because he discovered it before discouragement hardened into identity, he crossed the most dangerous stretch of the entire process. Now let me say one more thing. The world keeps trying to teach people that compounding should be exciting if it is working. That is another lie. Boring is what working often feels like in the middle. Regular, mechanical, uneventful. Then one day boring becomes extraordinary simply because it was allowed to continue. That is why I trust boring so much. The public worships excitement and pays for it dearly. I prefer things that keep functioning after the emotion leaves the room. So if you are beginning now, or if you are in the ugly early part and wondering whether this whole thing is a joke, I would tell you exactly what I would tell Harry. Do not ask the first stage of compounding to entertain you. Ask it to harden you. Do not ask the account to flatter you. Ask it to prove that your system works. Do not track the wrong scoreboard. Track what is actually growing. Do not rely on motivation. Build a cue. Build a rule. Build a friction against quitting. Build a person who protects the engine. The engine comes first. The visible speed comes later. That is the only order I trust. And if you respect that order, one day you will wake up and realize the thing you once thought was dead has begun carrying you. At that moment, people often call it luck. It is not luck. It is the delayed reward for surviving the most emotionally misleading phase in personal finance. The boring chapter decided the ending. It always does.